Some places hold their secrets like a mother holds her sleeping child, gentle, protective, and unwilling to let go. Louise Hartwell had walked these Colorado mountain paths for 43 years, believing she knew every stone and shadow that belonged to her family's ranch. On a quiet September morning, while mending old fence lines, she found something that would change everything. Behind a curtain of moss and fallen rock, a cave entrance opened into the mountainside like a doorway to the past. Cool air flowed from the darkness, carrying scents of earth and time itself. Inside, strange symbols covered the stone walls, markings older than any map, older than her family's claim to this land. The town below had stories they preferred to keep buried, but these carved stones whispered of truths that wouldn't stay hidden. What had 3 generations of her family never told her about this mountain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hartwell ranch as Louise stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug warming her weathered hands. Through the glass, she could see the eastern ridge, where yesterday's discovery had turned her orderly world upside down. The cave entrance was invisible from here, hidden by distance and the natural curve of the mountainside. But she felt its presence like a splinter under the skin. 3 generations of Hartwells had called this valley home. Her great-grandfather, Thomas, had claimed this land in 1882, building the original cabin where the kitchen now stood. Her grandfather expanded it into a proper house, and her father had added the modern conveniences, indoor plumbing, electricity, a telephone line that still crackled during storms. Louise had inherited more than just the deed. She'd inherited the stories, the responsibility, and the bone-deep knowledge that came from a lifetime spent reading the mountain's moods. The ranch sprawled across nearly 800 acres of high country, most of it too steep or rocky for cattle. But there were meadows tucked into the folds of the mountains, where wildflowers bloomed in summer and snow lingered well into May. The main house sat in a natural bowl, protected from the worst winds by stands of aspen and pine that her grandfather had planted as windbreaks. A creek ran year-round through the property, fed by snowmelt and springs that had never failed. Even in the driest years, Louise had raised 2 children here, Michael and Sarah, teaching them to read the weather in cloud formations and to find their way home by the shape of the peaks. But the mountains that had held her heart had felt too small to her children. Michael lived in Denver now, managing investments for people who had more money than sense. Sarah had married a software engineer and moved to Seattle, where she raised Louise's grandchildren among coffee shops and traffic jams. They visited for holidays and sent photographs, but the ranch that had shaped Louise's soul was just a pleasant memory to them. Her husband David had understood. For 37 years they'd worked this land together, fixing fence lines and moving cattle, reading to each other in the evenings and planning improvements they'd make come spring. David had died 4 years ago, quietly in his sleep, after a day spent splitting firewood and grumbling about the truck's carburetor. The grief had nearly broken her, but the land demanded tending, and the routine of caring for something larger than herself had pulled her through the worst of it. Now, at 63, Louise knew every trail, every seasonal stream, every place where elk came to drink and eagles nested in the cliff faces. She knew which meadows would flood during spring runoff, and where to find the best huckleberries in late summer. She thought she knew her mountain secrets as well as she knew the lines on her own face. The carved symbols in the cave had proven her wrong. Louise had found the weathered granite marker first, partially buried near where she'd been repairing a section of fence damaged by last winter's storms. The stone was roughly the size of a dinner plate, with markings that looked deliberate but unlike anything she'd seen before. Not carved by ranchers marking boundaries, not the scratches animals made sharpening claws or antlers. These marks had intention behind them, patterns that suggested meaning, even if she couldn't read them. Following her instincts, she traced a rough line from the marker toward the cliff face, looking for anything else that seemed out of place. That's when she'd noticed the moss-covered depression in the rock wall. At first glance, it looked like a natural shadow, but the moss had grown in a peculiar way, following the edges of what might have been an opening. When she'd pulled away the vegetation and shifted the fallen stones, the cave mouth had revealed itself like a well-kept secret finally ready to be told. The symbols inside were more elaborate, covering sections of the cave walls in patterns that spoke of time and patience. Someone had spent considerable effort making these marks, using tools to carve deliberately into stone that would outlast any wooden post or metal fence. These weren't casual scratches or the work of bored travelers. They felt important, ceremonial even, though Louise couldn't begin to guess their meaning. She'd spent the rest of yesterday afternoon sitting at her kitchen table with her grandmother's hand-drawn map spread before her. The map showed the ranch boundaries as they'd existed in her grandmother's time, with notes about seasonal grazing areas and water sources marked in fading ink. But there was no indication of the cave, no mention of the granite marker, nothing to suggest her family had ever known about the site Louise had discovered. That seemed impossible. Her grandmother had been meticulous about documenting the land, noting everything from mineral deposits to wildlife patterns. She'd marked springs that only flowed during wet years and identified trees that had been struck by lightning. How could she have missed something as significant as a cave carved with ancient symbols? Louise's neighbor, Frank Morrison, had stopped by that evening with a bottle of whiskey and an offer to help with the fence repair. Frank was 71. A widower whose own ranch bordered the Hartwell property to the south. He'd known Louise's family for 40 years and had stories about her father that still made her laugh. When she'd mentioned finding some old markings near the fence line, Frank had grown unexpectedly quiet. Probably nothing to worry about, he'd said, pouring himself a second glass. Mountains are full of old scratches and such. Indians, maybe, or prospectors marking claims that didn't pan out. Best not to go borrowing trouble. The response had struck Louise as odd. Frank was usually curious about anything related to local history, the kind of man who could tell you which rancher had owned what parcel in 1923 and where the old mining roads used to run. His dismissive attitude about her discovery felt wrong, like a note played out of tune. After Frank left, Louise had called her son Michael in Denver. She'd intended to tell him about the cave, but something in his voice, the distracted way he'd answered, the background noise of traffic and city life, had made her change her mind. Instead, she'd asked about the grandchildren and listened to him complain about his commute. When he'd asked how she was doing, she'd said fine, everything was fine, but everything wasn't fine. The discovery had unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just the mystery of the symbols or the fact that her family's map didn't show the cave. It was the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something that had been deliberately hidden, something that people who should have told her about it had chosen to keep secret. This morning, Louise had decided to call the County Historical Society. If anyone would know about Native American sites or historical markings in the area, it would be Eleanor Vance, the Society's president, and the closest thing their small town had to a professional historian. Eleanor was in her 70s, a retired school teacher who'd spent decades collecting stories and documents about the valley's early settlement. She'd written several pamphlets about local history and had been instrumental in getting the old mining structures designated as historical sites. But when Louise explained what she'd found, Eleanor's response had been even stranger than Frank's. "Oh my," Eleanor had said, her voice taking on a careful tone. "That does sound intriguing. But you know, Louise, these mountains have seen so many different people over the years. Miners, hunters, drifters. Could be anything, really. Probably best to let sleeping dogs lie, if you know what I mean." Louise didn't know what she meant. Eleanor Vance had never met a historical mystery she didn't want to solve. She'd spent 3 years researching the story behind a single photograph of the town's founding families and had once driven to the state archives in Denver to verify the details of a mine accident from 1897. The idea that she'd dismiss ancient symbols without even wanting to see them was completely out of character. 2 conversations, 2 people she trusted, both suggesting she should ignore what might be the most significant historical discovery in the valley's recorded history. The more Louise thought about it, the more convinced she became that there was something about the cave that other people already knew. She'd spent the morning going through her grandmother's papers more carefully, looking for any reference to the area where she'd made the discovery. Among the deed documents and property surveys, she'd found a folder of correspondence between her great-grandfather and various territorial officials. Most of it was routine business, applications for water rights, requests for boundary surveys, complaints about cattle rustlers, but one letter had caught her attention. Written in 1886, it was from Thomas Hartwell to the Territorial Land Office, requesting clarification about a parcel on the eastern edge of his property. The letter mentioned complications regarding prior usage and asked for guidance about appropriate procedures for disputed areas. The Land Office's response, if there had been one, wasn't in the folder. Louise had studied the property description in the letter, comparing it to modern boundaries. The area Thomas had written about included the section where she'd found the cave. Whatever complications he'd encountered, they'd apparently been resolved in his favor, since the family had maintained clear title to the land for more than a century. But the phrase prior usage suggested that someone else had been using the land before Thomas claimed it. In 1886, that most likely meant Native Americans. The timing made sense. The last of the local tribes had been moved to reservations in the 1870s and early 1880s. But it was entirely possible that some had continued to visit traditional sites even after the official relocations. If the cave had been a Native American site, that would explain the symbols and the deliberate nature of the carvings. It might also explain why people seemed reluctant to discuss Louise's discovery. Land disputes involving Native American claims could be complicated, even more than a century later. There were laws protecting sacred sites and cultural landmarks, laws that could potentially affect property rights. The thought made Louise uneasy, but not because she was worried about losing her land. If the cave was truly a significant Native American site, she wanted to do the right thing. David had always said that the land didn't really belong to them. They were just taking care of it for a while. Like every generation before them and every generation that would come after. What bothered her was the possibility that her family had known about the site's significance and had chosen to hide it. The idea that Thomas, her grandfather, her father, and even her grandmother might have been part of a deliberate cover-up felt like a betrayal of everything she'd believed about their character. Louise made herself another cup of coffee and sat back down with the folder of family papers. There had to be more to the story. Thomas Hartwell's letter about complications regarding prior usage was too vague to draw firm conclusions, but it was a starting point. If she could find more correspondence or records from the Territorial Land Office, she might be able to piece together what had really happened in 1886. The local library might have copies of territorial records, or at least indexes that could point her in the right direction. Eleanor Vance might have relevant documents in the Historical Society's collection, though given her reaction to Louise's discovery, she might not be willing to share them. There was also the possibility of contacting the reservation 40 miles north. Tribal historians there would know about traditional sites in the region and might be able to help interpret the symbols in the cave. But first, Louise wanted to return to the cave for a more thorough exploration. Yesterday's discovery had been accidental, and she'd been too surprised to examine the site carefully. If she was going to contact outside experts, she needed to understand what she was dealing with. She needed photographs, measurements, a detailed record of the symbols and their arrangement. As she prepared for another trip to the eastern ridge, Louise found herself thinking about David. He'd been the one with the camera and the steady hands for detailed work. He would have known how to document the discovery properly, and he would have had opinions about what to do next. David had been suspicious of authority figures and institutional explanations. always pushing Louise to ask more questions and dig deeper into subjects that interested her. "Don't let other people do your thinking for you," he used to say, "especially when they've got reasons to want you thinking something particular." Frank Morrison and Eleanor Vance clearly had reasons for wanting Louise to dismiss her discovery. She just didn't know what those reasons were yet. But David would have told her to find out, and that's exactly what she intended to do. Louise returned to the cave the next morning, armed with a flashlight, her camera, and a notebook she'd bought specifically for documenting the discovery. The September air held the first hint of autumn's bite, and frost glittered on the meadow grass as she climbed toward the eastern ridge. She'd told herself this would be a careful, methodical exploration, photograph the symbols, measure the cave's dimensions, perhaps sketch the most detailed carvings. She hadn't expected to find human remains. The cave extended further back than she'd realized during her first visit. What had appeared to be a shallow depression in the rock face actually opened into a chamber large enough to stand upright in, with passages leading deeper into the mountain. Louise had been photographing the wall symbols when her flashlight beam caught something pale in an alcove she hadn't noticed before. At first, she'd thought it was a rock formation or perhaps mineral deposits. But as she moved closer, the pale objects resolved into unmistakable shapes: the curve of a skull, the delicate architecture of finger bones, fragments that could only be ribs. The remains were arranged in what looked like deliberate positioning, not scattered as they would be if animals had dragged a carcass into the cave. Beside the bones sat a clay vessel, its surface decorated with patterns that echoed the symbols carved into the walls. The pot was small enough to hold in 2 hands, with a narrow neck and a rounded body that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Dark stains on the clay suggested it had once held something, though time had long since consumed whatever contents it might have preserved. Louise had backed away from the alcove, her heart racing as the implications of the discovery settled in. This wasn't just a cave with interesting historical markings. This was a burial site, a place where someone had been laid to rest, with ceremony and intention. The careful arrangement of the remains, the decorated pottery, the symbols on the walls, everything pointed to this being a sacred space, a location of deep spiritual significance, and if these were Native American remains, as seemed likely given the age and context, then her discovery had just become a matter for federal authorities. There were laws protecting Native American burial sites, protocols that had to be followed, notifications that had to be made. This was no longer something she could investigate on her own or simply ignore, as Frank and Eleanor had suggested. Louise had spent 20 minutes documenting the scene with her camera, being careful not to disturb anything while making sure she had clear photographs of the remains, the pottery, and the surrounding symbols. Her hands had shaken slightly as she worked, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. These bones represented a person, someone who had lived and died and been mourned by family and community. They deserved respect and proper treatment. The walk back to the house had given her time to think about next steps. She'd need to contact the sheriff's office first. They would know the proper procedures for reporting the discovery. The county coroner would probably need to be involved, and eventually federal authorities if the remains were confirmed to be Native American. There would be investigations, examinations, bureaucratic processes that could take months or even years to complete. By the time Louise reached her kitchen, she'd made up her mind. She called the sheriff's office and explained what she'd found, speaking carefully and sticking to the facts. The dispatcher had transferred her to Deputy Sheriff Tom Kellerman, a man Louise had known since he was a boy, running around his grandfather's ranch. Tom had listened without interruption, asked a few clarifying questions about the location, and promised to drive out that afternoon to assess the situation. "You did the right thing calling this in, Mrs. Hartwell," Tom had said. "These kinds of discoveries need to be handled properly. I'll bring someone from the coroner's office with me, just to make sure we follow all the protocols." Louise had appreciated his matter-of-fact tone. Tom was young, maybe 35, but he'd grown up in the valley and understood the delicate balance between respecting the past and dealing with present realities. If anyone could handle this situation with appropriate sensitivity, it would be him. But when Tom arrived that afternoon, he wasn't alone. Behind his patrol car came a white SUV carrying two men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as representatives from the state attorney general's office. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere from a routine investigation to something much more formal and concerning. Mrs. Hartwell, the older of the two men, had said, extending a business card. "I'm Assistant Attorney General Marcus Webb. This is my colleague, Investigator James Chen. We understand you've made some discoveries on your property that may have historical significance." The phrase historical significance had struck Louise as oddly euphemistic for human remains, but she'd led the group up to the cave without comment. Webb and Chen had examined the site with professional thoroughness, taking their own photographs and measurements while discussing the scene in voices too low for Louise to hear clearly. Tom Kellerman had stayed close to Louise during the examination, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the state officials worked. When Webb finally emerged from the cave's depths, his demeanor had shifted from professional interest to something that looked suspiciously like concern. "Mrs. Hartwell," Webb had said, "we're going to need to secure this site immediately. There are protocols for dealing with discoveries like this, and we need to ensure that nothing is disturbed while we conduct a proper investigation." "What kind of investigation?" Louise had asked. "These appear to be Native American remains. Shouldn't the tribal authorities be contacted?" Webb and Chen had exchanged a look that Louise couldn't interpret. "We'll be handling the notifications," Chen had said. "For now, we need you to understand that this is an active investigation site. No one should enter the cave or disturb anything in the surrounding area until we've completed our assessment." The way he'd phrased it, "our assessment," had sounded more like a warning than an explanation. Louise had gotten the distinct impression that the state officials were less interested in protecting Native American remains than in controlling access to information about the discovery. After the officials left, Tom had lingered for a few minutes, clearly wanting to say something, but uncertain how to phrase it. Finally, as they walked back toward the house, he'd spoken quietly. "Mrs. Hartwell, you might want to be careful about who you discuss this discovery with. Sometimes these old sites, they stir up complications that nobody really wants to deal with." The state boys seemed pretty concerned about keeping things quiet. "Quiet why?" Louise had asked. "If this is a legitimate archaeological site, shouldn't it be studied properly? Shouldn't the tribal community be involved?" Tom had stopped walking and looked back toward the ridge where the cave was hidden. "I don't know all the details, but there've been rumors for years about things that happened in this valley back in the early days. Stories that the old families don't like to talk about. Your discovery might be connected to some of that history." "What kind of stories?" "The kind that could cause problems for a lot of people if they turned out to be true," Tom had said. "I'm not saying you should ignore what you found, Mrs. Hartwell, but you might want to think carefully about how you proceed. There are folks in this valley who have a lot invested in keeping certain stories buried." After Tom left, Louise had sat on her front porch as the sun set behind the western peaks, trying to process the day's events. The discovery of human remains had transformed her interesting historical find into something much more complex and politically charged. The presence of state officials suggested that her cave wasn't just locally significant. It was connected to something that had attracted attention at the highest levels of government. But it was Tom's warning about old families and buried stories that troubled her most. Louise had lived in this valley her entire life, and she'd always believed she understood its history. The official story was straightforward. Hardy pioneers had settled the region in the 1880s, establishing ranches and building communities through hard work and determination. There had been conflicts with Native American tribes, But those had been resolved when the government established reservations and compensated the displaced peoples. Now Tom was suggesting that the official story might be incomplete, or worse, deliberately misleading. If the remains in the cave were connected to some darker chapter of local history, that would explain why Frank Morrison and Eleanor Vance had been so eager to discourage her investigation. It might also explain why state officials had appeared so quickly and seemed so interested in controlling access to the site. As darkness settled over the ranch, Louise found herself facing a choice she hadn't anticipated when she'd discovered the cave entrance 2 days earlier. She could accept the official response, let the state investigators handle everything, and return to her quiet life, tending the ranch and remembering her husband. Or she could dig deeper into the mystery, following the threads that Tom had hinted at, and Frank and Eleanor had tried to discourage her from pursuing. The decision should have been easy. Louise was 63 years old, a widow living alone on a remote ranch. She wasn't an investigator or an activist. She had no particular expertise in archaeology or Native American history. The sensible thing would be to let the authorities handle the situation and trust that they would do the right thing. But as she looked out at the dark silhouette of the eastern ridge, Louise thought about the careful arrangement of the bones in the cave, the decorated pottery that spoke of love and reverence, the symbols carved into stone by people who had wanted their stories to survive. Someone had taken great care to honor the dead in that sacred space. The least she could do was take equal care to honor the truth about how they had died. Tomorrow, she would begin asking questions that people apparently didn't want answered. She owed that much to the bones in the cave, and to the part of herself that refused to let sleeping dogs lie when those dogs were guarding. Graves, the archaeological team, arrived 3 days later in a convoy of university vehicles that looked out of place on the mountain roads. Louise watched from her kitchen window as they set up equipment near the cave entrance, their movements efficient and professional. She'd been expecting them ever since Deputy Kellerman had called to warn her that specialists would be coming to conduct a proper assessment of the site. Dr. Rebecca Torres, the team leader, had knocked on Louise's door that first morning with coffee in a thermos and an easy smile that immediately put Louise at ease. She was younger than Louise had expected, probably in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and work clothes that showed she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. "Mrs. Hartwell," she'd said, "I know this must be disruptive, having strangers tramping around your property. I wanted to introduce myself and explain what we'll be doing." Louise had invited her in, grateful for someone who seemed willing to treat her as more than an inconvenient bystander. Over coffee, Dr. Torres had explained that the preliminary examination had confirmed the remains were indeed Native American, probably dating back to the mid-1800s based on the pottery style and burial practices. "The cave appears to have been used as a sacred burial site," Dr. Torres had said. "The symbols on the walls are consistent with spiritual markings we've seen at other sites in the region. This is exactly the kind of discovery that needs careful documentation and respectful treatment. Will the tribal authorities be involved?" Louise had asked. "Absolutely. We've already contacted the Northern Ute Cultural Resource Department. They'll be sending representatives to oversee our work and ensure everything is handled according to traditional protocols." Dr. Torres's straightforward approach was a relief after the evasiveness Louise had encountered from local officials. But that afternoon, as Louise was reading on her front porch, she'd overheard a heated conversation between Dr. Torres and one of the state investigators who'd returned to check on the team's progress. "Dr. Torres, I need to emphasize that this investigation has sensitive aspects," the investigator had said. "We need to be very careful about what information becomes public. And when? My concern is conducting proper archaeological work," Dr. Torres had replied, her voice carrying an edge Louise hadn't heard before. "These remains deserve respectful treatment and thorough documentation. That's what we're here to do." Of course, but there are other considerations. Legal complications that could arise if certain details become widely known before we've had a chance to assess their implications. Louise hadn't been able to hear Dr. Torres's response, but the tone of the conversation had confirmed her growing suspicion that the state's interest in the cave went beyond archaeological protocol. That evening, Louise had driven to the county library in town, a small building that housed both historical records and Eleanor Vance's collection of local documents. Eleanor hadn't been there, but the librarian, a young woman named Katie Morrison, Frank's granddaughter, had been helpful in directing Louise to the territorial records section. Louise had spent 2 hours going through territorial land office, correspondence from the 1880s, looking for any mention of her great-grandfather's property or the complications regarding prior usage he'd written about. Most of the records were routine, claims filed, surveys completed, fees paid. But buried in a folder of miscellaneous correspondence, she'd found something that made her pulse quicken. The document was a petition signed by several early settlers, including Thomas Hartwell, requesting military assistance to deal with what they termed ongoing native hostilities in the eastern sections of the valley. The petition was dated September 1885, just a year before Thomas's letter about land complications. It described raids on livestock, damage to property, and threats to settlers who were trying to establish legitimate claims to territorial land. But what struck Louise most was the petition's reference to unauthorized native activities at traditional sites and the need to resolve conflicting claims to ensure settler safety and territorial sovereignty. The language was formal and bureaucratic, but it suggested that Native Americans had been continuing to use traditional sites in the valley even after the official relocations to reservations. Among the territorial records, Louise found fragments of what appeared to be a settler's journal, with entries describing tensions between Native Americans and new arrivals in the valley. The journal pages were water-stained and partially illegible, but she could make out enough to understand that the situation had been more complex than the simple narrative of peaceful settlement she'd grown up hearing. One entry, dated August 1885, described finding evidence of recent native presence at the ceremonial cave on the eastern ridge, a description that perfectly matched the location where Louise had made her discovery. The journal writer noted that local tribes continued to visit the site despite territorial orders forbidding such activities, creating what he called an untenable situation for settlers trying to establish clear property rights. Louise had photographed the relevant pages with her phone and left the library with more questions than answers. The documents suggested that her great-grandfather and other early settlers had been aware of the cave's significance to Native Americans, and that there had been ongoing conflicts about access to traditional sites. But the official resolution of these conflicts wasn't clear from the territorial records. When she'd returned home, Louise had found Dr. Torres waiting on her porch with a troubled expression. "Mrs. Hartwell, I wanted to talk to you about something we found in the cave today," Dr. Torres had said. "We discovered additional remains in a section we hadn't fully explored yet. But there's something unusual about them." "Unusual how?" "The bones show signs of trauma that suggest these people died violently. Cut marks on the ribs, a skull fracture that was almost certainly fatal. This wasn't a natural death or even death in battle. This looks like it might have been a massacre." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Louise had felt something cold settle in her stomach as the implications became clear. "Dr. Torres, those journal fragments I found at the library, they mentioned conflicts between settlers and Native Americans who were still using the cave. Do you think there's a connection?" "I think we need to be very careful about drawing conclusions before we have all the evidence," Dr. Torres had said. "But yes, the timing and location suggest this could be connected to the territorial period conflicts. If that's the case, then what we're dealing with isn't just an archaeological site. It's a crime scene from 1885. Murder doesn't have a statute of limitations, Mrs. Hartwell, and if these deaths were connected to illegal actions by territorial settlers, there could be legal implications that extend to the present day. Property rights, reparations, federal recognition of tribal claims. A lot of people might have a lot to lose if the full story comes out. That night, Louise had called her daughter Sarah in Seattle, finally ready to share what was happening on the ranch. But when Sarah answered, she'd been dealing with a sick child and a work crisis. And Louise had found herself minimizing the situation rather than adding to her daughter's stress. Just some old artifacts they found on the property, Louise had said. Archaeologists are taking a look. Nothing serious. After hanging up, Louise had sat in her darkened kitchen, feeling more alone than she had since David's death. The weight of what she'd discovered, not just human remains, but evidence of historical violence that powerful people seemed determined to keep hidden, felt too heavy to carry by herself. But as she looked toward the eastern ridge where lights from the archaeological camp flickered in the darkness, Louise thought about the careful arrangement of bones in the cave, the decorated pottery that spoke of love and loss, the symbols carved by people who had wanted their story to survive even if they couldn't. Someone had taken great care to honor the dead in that sacred place. The least Louise could do was take equal care to honor the truth about how they had died. Even if that truth made some people very uncomfortable, the town meeting had been Eleanor Vance's idea. Though Louise suspected the Historical Society president was more interested in damage control than genuine community discussion, the meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community center, a low building next to the volunteer fire station that usually hosted potluck dinners and church socials. By 7 o'clock, the parking lot was full, and people were standing along the walls inside. Louise had arrived early, taking a seat in the front row where she could see everyone and, more importantly, where everyone could see her. She dressed carefully in her best wool dress and the silver jewelry David had given her for their 30th anniversary, armor for a battle. She was finally ready to fight. Eleanor had opened the meeting with a carefully worded explanation of recent archaeological discoveries on the Hartwell property, emphasizing the preliminary nature of the findings and the need for careful consideration of their implications. Her tone suggested that the whole situation was slightly embarrassing, like discussing a relative's drinking problem at a family gathering. "We need to remember," Eleanor had said, "that our valley has a proud history of cooperation and mutual respect. Whatever happened in the past, we've built a strong community here, and we don't want to let old conflicts divide us now." Frank Morrison had spoken next, his weathered face serious as he addressed the crowd. "Folks, I've lived in this valley for 71 years, and my family's been here even longer. We all know there were difficulties in the early days. That's just the way things were back then. But digging up old bones isn't going to change anything or help anybody. Sometimes it's better to let the past stay buried." The applause that followed Frank's remarks had been scattered but emphatic, coming mostly from the older residents who'd grown up with the established version of local history. But Louise had noticed that the younger people in the crowd, families who'd moved to the valley more recently, drawn by the rural lifestyle and mountain scenery, seemed less convinced by calls to ignore the discovery. Dr. Torres had been invited to present the archaeological team's preliminary findings, though Eleanor had clearly hoped for a brief, technical presentation that would minimize community concern. Instead, Dr. Torres had methodically described what they'd found in the cave: multiple sets of human remains, evidence of violent death, pottery and artifacts, suggesting the site had been used for ceremonial burials over an extended period. "Based on the evidence we've collected so far," Dr. Torres had said, "it appears that this cave was a sacred burial site for Native Americans in the region, possibly for several generations. The violent nature of the deaths we've documented suggests these people were killed rather than dying from natural causes or even battle casualties." A murmur had run through the crowd at this statement. Louise had seen people glancing at each other, some with concern, Others with what looked like irritation at having their comfortable assumptions challenged. Tom Kellerman had tried to moderate the discussion that followed, but it quickly became clear that the community was deeply divided about how to handle the discovery. The fault lines weren't just generational, they seemed to follow patterns of family history and economic interest that Louise was only beginning to understand. Real estate developer Brad Coleman had been among the most vocal opponents of further investigation. "Look, I don't want to minimize the historical significance of whatever Mrs. Hartwell found," he'd said, "but we need to think about the practical implications here. If we start treating every old bone that turns up as a major archaeological site, it's going to have a serious impact on property values and development opportunities in the valley." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Louise had said, rising from her seat for the first time since the meeting began. "Maybe we should be more concerned about honoring the people who died on this land than about our property values." The comment had earned her both supportive nods and hostile stares. Louise had felt the weight of the community's attention as she continued. "Dr. Torres said these people were murdered. If that's true, don't we have an obligation to find out what happened? Don't we owe them that much?" Eleanor had quickly tried to regain control of the discussion. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand your feelings, but we need to be careful about jumping to conclusions. The archaeological evidence is still being analyzed, and there could be many explanations for what they've found. But it was during the coffee break that Louise made her most significant discovery of the evening. While most people gathered in small groups to continue their discussions, Louise had found herself alone near the Historical Society's display table, looking at photographs of the valley's early settlers. Among the familiar faces of founding families, she'd noticed a silver locket in one of the old photographs, worn by a woman identified only as Mrs. Thompson, 1884. The locket was distinctive, oval-shaped with an intricate floral pattern etched into the silver. Louise had seen that exact piece of jewelry before, though it had taken her a moment to remember where. Then it hit her. During her second exploration of the cave, she'd found the same locket tucked beneath a ledge near the remains, tarnished by time, but unmistakably the same piece. Louise had stared at the photograph for several minutes, her mind racing through the implications. If the locket in the cave belonged to Mrs. Thompson from 1884, and if Mrs. Thompson had been a settler rather than a Native American, then the story was more complicated than anyone had suggested. What was a settler woman's jewelry doing in a Native American burial cave? When the meeting resumed, Louise had raised her hand immediately. "Eleanor, I have a question about this photograph." She'd pointed to the display table. "The woman identified as Mrs. Thompson, do you have any more information about her?" Eleanor's face had gone pale as she looked at the photograph Louise was indicating. Well, the Historical Society's records from that period are somewhat incomplete. Many families lost documents in fires, floods, that sort of thing. But this locket she's wearing," Louise had pressed, "it's quite distinctive. Do you know what happened to Mrs. Thompson? Is she buried in the town cemetery?" "Mrs. Hartwell," Frank Morrison had interrupted, his voice carrying a warning, "I think you're getting a bit carried away here. Old photographs don't prove anything about what you found in that cave." But Dr. Torres had leaned forward with interest. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you saying you've seen this locket before?" "I found one exactly like it in the cave," Louise had said, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from several people in the audience. "Same pattern, same size. If this Mrs. Thompson disappeared in 1884 and her locket ended up in a cave with murdered Native Americans, don't you think that raises some important questions?" The meeting had deteriorated rapidly after that revelation. Eleanor had tried to maintain order, but competing voices had filled the room as people demanded explanations, dismissed Louise's claims, or called for immediate action. Brad Coleman had accused Louise of fabricating evidence to create a media sensation that would damage the community. Several families had walked out in apparent disgust, but Louise had also found unexpected allies. Janet Phillips, a teacher who'd moved to the valley 5 years earlier, had spoken passionately about the need to face historical truths rather than hiding from them. Mark Donovan, whose family ran the town's only restaurant, had pointed out that acknowledging the valley's complete history, including its darker chapters, might actually attract historically minded tourists rather than driving away business. Most importantly, Dr. Torres had approached Louise after the meeting with genuine interest in the locket discovery. "Mrs. Hartwell, if you're willing, I'd like to examine the locket you found and compare it to this photograph. If they match, it could provide crucial evidence about what happened in that cave." Evidence of what exactly? Louise had asked. Evidence that the violence wasn't just between settlers and Native Americans, Dr. Torres had said quietly. Evidence that settlers might have been victims too, which would suggest something much more complex and disturbing than simple frontier conflicts. As Louise had driven home through the mountain darkness, she'd reflected on how the evening had revealed the deep fractures in her community. Some people genuinely wanted to understand what had happened in the cave, while others seemed desperate to prevent that understanding from emerging. The pattern was becoming clear. Families with the longest history in the valley, families whose property rights dated back to the territorial period, were the most resistant to investigation. That suggested they had the most to lose if the truth about the 1880s came to light. The anonymous note had been waiting on her kitchen table when she'd arrived home, slipped under her door while she was at the meeting. The message was brief and written in block letters. "Some secrets are buried for good reasons. Stop digging or face the consequences." Louise had read the note twice, then calmly folded it and put it in the folder with her other documents related to the cave discovery. Threats meant she was getting close to something important. David had taught her that much during his years of dealing with contentious water rights disputes and boundary disagreements. But as she'd prepared for bed, Louise had found herself checking the locks on her doors and windows for the first time in years. The anonymous note had been more than a warning. It had been a promise, and she was beginning to understand that some people in her community were willing to go to considerable lengths to keep the past buried. Louise made her decision while watching the sunrise paint the eastern ridge in shades of gold and rose. Despite the anonymous threat, despite the community pressure, despite her son, Michael's increasingly concerned phone calls urging her to let the authorities handle everything, she was going to see this through to the end. The people in that cave deserved justice, and the truth deserved to be told. Dr. Torres had confirmed that the locket found in the cave was identical to the one worn by Mrs. Thompson in the 1884 photograph. More disturbing, chemical analysis of the metal had revealed traces of blood that had been preserved by the cave's dry conditions. Whatever had happened to Mrs. Thompson, it had been violent, and it had happened in the same place where Native Americans had been killed. "This changes everything," Dr. Torres had told Louise during a private meeting at the ranch. "We're not looking at a simple conflict between settlers and Native Americans. We're looking at something that involved multiple victims from different communities." The archaeological team had also made another discovery that painted an even darker picture of events in 1885, hidden beneath layers of debris in the deepest section of the cave. They'd found hand-forged iron tools, knives, hatchets, and implements that bore no resemblance to traditional Native American weapons or typical settler farming equipment. The metal had been analyzed and dated to the 1880s, but the craftsmanship was distinctive, suggesting they'd been made specifically for violence rather than everyday use. "These aren't weapons of opportunity," Dr. Torres had explained. "Someone planned this violence, prepared for it with specially made tools. This wasn't a spontaneous conflict or even a raid gone wrong. This was systematic killing." Louise had spent the morning walking her property, trying to process the implications of the archaeological findings. The cave wasn't just a burial site. It was evidence of a planned massacre that had targeted both Native Americans and at least one settler woman. The question that haunted her was why Mrs. Thompson had been killed alongside Native Americans, and who had been responsible for the violence. Michael had arrived from Denver that afternoon. his BMW sedan looking absurdly out of place on the ranch roads. Louise had known from his tone during their recent phone conversations that he was coming to talk sense into her, as he'd put it. What she hadn't expected was the legal document he'd brought with him. "Mum, I've been talking to lawyers about this situation," he'd said without preamble, spreading papers across her kitchen table. "There are legal protections for elderly people who might be taken advantage of during traumatic situations. If this cave business is affecting your judgment—" "My judgment is fine, Michael," Louise had interrupted. "What's affecting my judgment is having my own son suggest I'm incompetent for wanting to find out the truth about a mass murder. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Mum, you're 63 years old, living alone on a remote ranch, and you've become obsessed with some old bones that may or may not be connected to historical events that happened before you were born. This isn't healthy." Louise had looked at her son, her successful, practical, city-dwelling son who'd inherited David's analytical mind, but none of his stubborn integrity, and felt a sadness that went deeper than disappointment. "Michael, those old bones were people. They were murdered, and someone has been covering up that murder for more than a century. If I don't pursue this, who will? The authorities, Mum, the professionals who are trained to handle these situations. You don't need to be personally involved in every aspect of the investigation." But Louise had learned not to trust the authorities' commitment to uncovering the truth. The state investigators had been notably absent since the archaeological team had begun finding evidence of systematic violence. Deputy Kellerman had told her confidentially that he'd been instructed to refer all inquiries about the cave to state offices, and those offices weren't returning. Phone calls from the media or from tribal representatives trying to get information about the investigation's progress. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Janet Phillips, the teacher who'd spoken up at the community meeting, had approached Louise with information she'd discovered while researching local history for a class project. Janet had been trying to verify stories about the valley's founding families when she'd found discrepancies in the territorial land records that raised troubling questions about how some of the early settlers had acquired their property. "Mrs. Hartwell, I think I know why some people are so anxious to keep this discovery quiet," Janet had said, spreading photocopied documents across Louise's dining room table. "Look at these land transfer records from 1885 and 1886. The documents showed a pattern that became disturbing once Louise understood what she was looking at. In late 1885, several Native American families had filed claims for traditional lands in the eastern part of the valley, using provisions of territorial law that allowed indigenous people to claim title to lands they'd occupied for traditional purposes. The claims had been properly filed and appeared to be legally valid, but by early 1886, those same parcels had been claimed by white settlers, including Louise's great-grandfather, Thomas Hartwell. The Native American claims had simply disappeared from the records, with no indication of how they'd been resolved or why the original claimants had abandoned their legal rights to the land. This suggests that the Native Americans who filed these claims never had a chance to pursue them, Janet had said. They died before the claims could be processed, and the settlers simply took the land as if the previous claims had never existed. Louise had stared at the documents, revealing pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. "You're saying the massacre wasn't random violence? You're saying it was deliberate murder to steal land? I'm saying someone had a very practical motive for making sure those Native American families never lived to pursue their legal claims," Janet had said. And if Mrs. Thompson knew about it, or objected to it, that would explain why she ended up in the cave too. The revelation had left Louise feeling sick with more than just moral outrage. If Janet's theory was correct, then Louise's family's ownership of the ranch was based on theft and murder. The land she'd inherited, the land she'd loved and protected for 63 years, had been purchased with blood. That evening, Louise had called Dr. Torres to share Janet's research. The archaeologist had listened carefully, asking detailed questions about the land records and their implications. Mrs. Hartwell, "This provides crucial context for what we found in the cave," Dr. Torres had said. "If these families were killed to prevent them from pursuing legal land claims, then we're looking at federal crimes that may not have statutes of limitations. We're also looking at the possibility that current property ownership in the valley is based on fraudulent claims." "What does that mean for families like mine?" Louise had asked. "It means that the truth about what happened in 1885 could have legal consequences that extend to the present day. Property rights, reparations, tribal sovereignty claims, there's a lot at stake here, which explains why some people are so determined to keep this buried." As Louise had prepared for bed that night, she'd thought about Michael's legal papers and his threats to have her declared incompetent. She'd thought about the anonymous note warning her to stop digging. She'd thought about the state investigators who'd disappeared as soon as the evidence became inconvenient, and the community leaders who'd tried to dismiss her discovery from the very beginning. But mostly, she'd thought about the decorated pottery in the cave, placed with such care beside the bones of people who'd been murdered for wanting to keep their ancestral land. Someone had loved those people enough to honor them with proper burial, even in the face of violence and terror. The least Louise could do was love them enough to demand justice, even if that justice came more than a century too late. The discovery of the surveyor's transit and deed documents changed everything Louise thought, who she knew about her family's place in the valley's history. Dr. Torres had found them in a sealed section of the cave, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected them from moisture and decay for more than a century. The transit was a precision instrument used for surveying land boundaries, and the documents were official territorial papers bearing the seal of the land office. But these weren't just any land records. They were forgeries, and they provided a blueprint for how the massacre had been planned and executed. "Mrs. Hartwell, you need to see this," Dr. Torres had said, her voice tight with controlled anger as she spread the documents across Louise's kitchen table. "These papers show exactly how the land theft was organized. Someone surveyed the Native American claims in advance, created false documentation to override them, and then eliminated the people who could challenge the fraud. The surveyor's notes were methodical and chilling. They described the location of Native American encampments, the seasonal patterns of land use, and the legal vulnerability of families who were trying to navigate territorial claim procedures they didn't fully understand. The documents identified Mrs. Thompson as a territorial clerk who had discovered the fraudulent filings and was threatening to report them to federal authorities. She wasn't killed because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, Dr. Torres had explained. She was killed because she was trying to stop the land fraud. The massacre wasn't just about stealing land, it was about covering up the crime. Louise had studied the surveyor's notes, recognizing landmarks and boundaries that were still visible on her property today. The eastern meadow where she'd pastured cattle, the creek that provided water for the ranch, the ridge where she'd found the cave. All of it had been systematically mapped by someone planning mass murder. The signatures on the false documents included several names Louise recognized from the town's founding families. Her great-grandfather's name was there, along with Frank Morrison's grandfather and the ancestors of other families who still lived in the valley. The conspiracy hadn't been the work of a few individuals. It had involved most of the area's early settlers, working together to steal Native American land through violence and fraud. Dr. Torres had faced mounting pressure from the university to scale back the investigation. The dean of her department had called personally to express concerns about the political implications of the research and to suggest that the team might be over-interpreting the evidence they'd found. When Dr. Torres had refused to modify her findings, she'd been informed that her contract would not be renewed at the end of the academic year. "They're trying to bury this, just like it was buried in 1885, she'd told Louise. The difference is that now we have evidence, and we have people who are willing to fight for the truth. Louise had found an unexpected ally in the tribal council from the Northern Ute Reservation. When she'd finally contacted them directly, bypassing the state officials who had promised to handle tribal notifications, she'd discovered that they'd been trying to get information about the cave discovery for weeks. The state investigators had told them that the site was under review and that no outside involvement was needed at this time. Council Chairman Robert Clearwater had driven down from the reservation to meet with Louise personally. He was a man in his 70s, with silver hair and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. And he'd listened to Louise's account of the discovery, with the kind of focused attention that made her feel genuinely heard for the first time. Since this whole situation began, Mrs. Hartwell, he'd said after examining the photographs and documents, my great-grandmother used to tell stories about families that disappeared from this valley in the 1880s. She said they went to pursue land claims that the territorial government had promised to honor, and they were never seen again. We always assumed they'd been relocated to other reservations, but the government records were incomplete. Do you think these could be the same families? I think it's very likely. The pottery styles match our traditional designs from that period, and the burial practices are consistent with our customs. If these are our people, then we have a right to know how they died and to ensure they receive proper burial according to our traditions. Chairman Clearwater had also brought information that filled in crucial gaps in Louise's understanding of the territorial period. The federal government had indeed passed laws allowing Native Americans to claim traditional lands, but those laws had been widely opposed by white settlers who saw them as obstacles to territorial development. There had been documented cases of violence against Native Americans who attempted to file such claims. Though most of the evidence had been suppressed or destroyed, the truth about this period has been hidden for a long time, Chairman Clearwater had said. But hiding the truth doesn't make it go away. It just makes the eventual reckoning more painful. Louise's relationship with her son, Michael, had continued to deteriorate as the implications of the discovery became clear. He'd hired a lawyer to challenge her mental competency, arguing that her obsession with the cave was evidence of diminished capacity that made her vulnerable to manipulation by outside parties. The legal papers had been served while Chairman Clearwater was visiting, adding embarrassment to Louise's growing sense of isolation from her own family. Mom, you're destroying our family's reputation over something that happened before you were born, Michael had said during their last phone conversation. Even if everything you think is true, what's the point of exposing it now? The people responsible are dead. The victims are dead. All you're doing is hurting innocent people who had nothing to do with what happened. Michael, our family has been living on land that was stolen through murder, Louise had replied. How is that something we should just ignore? Because making a big public spectacle out of it isn't going to bring anyone back to life, and it could cost us everything we've worked for. Do you want to lose the ranch over this? Louise had hung up without answering, but Michael's question had haunted her for the rest of the day. Was she prepared to lose everything? Her land, her financial security, her relationship with her children, for the sake of historical justice? Was pursuing the truth worth the personal cost it was demanding? The answer had come to her that evening as she'd sat on her front porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The land spread out before her was beautiful, productive, and peaceful. But it was also built on a foundation of violence and lies. Living with that knowledge while doing nothing to address it would be a different kind of violence, a violence against truth, against justice, and against the memory of people who had died for the simple crime of wanting to keep their ancestral home. Louise had spent 63 years believing she was the caretaker of a family legacy built through honest work and determination. Now she understood that she was actually the inheritor of a crime scene, and she had a choice to make about what to do with that inheritance. She could protect the comfortable lies that had shaped her understanding of her place in the world, Or she could face the uncomfortable truth and try to make whatever amends were still possible. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than like a recognition of something that had already been decided the moment she'd first seen those carved symbols in the cave. Some truths were too important to bury, no matter how much it cost to dig them up. The hidden chamber revealed itself by accident, discovered when Dr. Torres noticed that her measuring equipment was giving inconsistent readings near the back wall of the cave. What had appeared to be solid rock was actually a carefully constructed false wall, built with stones that matched the cave's natural formation, but were held in place by clay mortar rather than geological processes. Louise had been with Dr. Torres when they'd removed the stones, working carefully to preserve whatever might be hidden behind them. The space beyond was small, barely large enough for a person to crouch inside, but it had been sealed so effectively that the air inside was dry and still. Like opening a time capsule, what they'd found inside changed everything. Louise thought she knew about the massacre and her family's role in it. The preserved documents were wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth and leather, protected so carefully that the ink was still clearly legible after more than a century. There were letters, newspaper clippings, legal papers, and most shocking of all, a detailed first-person account of the massacre written by someone who had witnessed the entire event. The witness was Elizabeth Thompson, the settler woman whose locket Louise had found among the remains. But Elizabeth hadn't died in the cave. She had escaped, hidden, and spent months documenting everything she had seen before sealing her testimony in the chamber and disappearing from the historical record. "My name is Elizabeth Thompson," the account began, "and I'm writing this in the year of our Lord 1886, knowing that I may not live to see justice done, but hoping that someday these words will serve as testimony to the evil that was committed in Blackbird Valley on September 15th, 1885. Louise had read the account aloud to Dr. Torres, her voice shaking as the full horror of what had happened became clear. Elizabeth's testimony was methodical and detailed, written by someone who understood that she was creating a legal document that might someday be used in court. The massacre had been planned weeks in advance by a group of territorial settlers led by Louise's great-grandfather, Thomas Hartwell. They had discovered that several Native American families were preparing to file land claims for traditional territories in the valley, claims that would have been legally valid under territorial law. Rather than accept the legitimacy of those claims, the settlers had decided to eliminate the claimants. They met in secret for 3 weeks, Elizabeth's account continued, discussing how to remove what they called the Indian problem without attracting attention from territorial authorities. Thomas Hartwell was the leader, but he had support from Morrison, Coleman, Vance, and a dozen other men whose names I will record here so that their descendants might know what their ancestors did in the name of progress and prosperity. Elizabeth had been present at the planning meetings because she worked as a clerk in the territorial land office and was romantically involved with one of the conspirators. She had initially believed they were discussing legal challenges to the Native American claims, not realizing until too late that they were planning mass murder. "I discovered their true intentions 3 days before the attack," she wrote. "I tried to warn the families at Blackbird Creek, but my English was poor and their understanding was limited. I managed to communicate danger to some, but not all. When I threatened to report the conspiracy to federal authorities, Thomas Hartwell decided that I was too much of a risk to leave alive. The attack had taken place at dawn, when the Native American families were gathered at the cave for a ceremony marking the autumn season. The settlers had surrounded the site and systematically killed everyone present, men, women, children, and elders who had come to participate in traditional observances. Elizabeth had hidden in the rocks above the cave and watched the entire massacre unfold. They used tools made specifically for killing," her account continued. "Knives and hatchets forged by the blacksmith Morrison to leave no trace of their identity. They killed without mercy or hesitation, showing no more emotion than men slaughtering cattle. When it was finished, they arranged the bodies to make it appear that the deaths had been part of some Indian ritual, thinking that territorial authorities would not investigate too closely if they believed the violence had been internal to the tribe. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Elizabeth's account described how the conspirators had then turned on each other, murdering several of their own members who had shown reluctance to participate or who were deemed security risks. The official story that had been passed down through generations, that Elizabeth Thompson had been killed by hostile Indians, was a lie created to cover up her murder by the very settlers who claimed to be her protectors. "I have hidden this testimony in the sacred cave where so many innocents died," Elizabeth's account concluded, "in the hope that someday someone with courage and conscience will discover the truth and ensure that justice is finally served. The men responsible have taken the land through murder and are building their fortunes on blood. They call themselves pioneers and founders, but they are nothing more than thieves and killers who have escaped punishment through conspiracy and silence." Louise had finished reading the account in complete silence, the weight of Elizabeth's words settling over her like a physical burden. Her great-grandfather hadn't just been present during the massacre, he had been its leader, the architect of a plan that had resulted in the deaths of at least 23 people, including children and elders who had posed no threat to anyone. Dr. Torres had examined the other documents in the hidden chamber, finding additional evidence that corroborated Elizabeth's account. There were copies of the original Native American land claims, proving that the families had been pursuing legal remedies through proper channels. There were fragments of correspondence between the conspirators, discussing how to dispose of evidence and coordinate their alibis. Most damning of all, there were photographs that Elizabeth had somehow obtained, showing some of the conspirators posing with the specialized weapons they had used in the massacre. "Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Torres had said gently, "I know this is difficult, but this evidence changes everything. We're not just dealing with a historical atrocity anymore. We have documented proof of premeditated murder and conspiracy, with clear identification of the people responsible. This is evidence that could be used in legal proceedings." Louise had stared at the photograph of her great-grandfather, a young man in his 20s, standing with a group of other settlers, all of them holding the hand-forged weapons that had been used to kill innocent families. Thomas Hartwell looked proud and confident in the image, like a man who believed he was building something important rather than destroying something sacred. "What kind of legal proceedings?" Louise had asked. "Federal investigations, reparations claims, challenges to property ownership based on fraudulent land claims. Mrs. Hartwell, if this evidence becomes public, it could affect the legal status of every piece of property in the valley that was claimed after 1885. The implications were staggering. Louise's ranch, Frank Morrison's property, the Coleman family's real estate holdings, even the land where the town itself was built, all of it could potentially be subject to legal challenges if it could be proven that the original claims were based on murder and fraud. But more than the legal implications, Louise was struggling with the personal betrayal of learning that her family's entire legacy was built on a lie. She had spent her life believing that the Hartwells were good people who had worked hard and treated others fairly. The discovery that her great-grandfather had been a murderer and that every subsequent generation had participated in covering up his crimes felt like a fundamental assault on her sense of identity. That night, Louise had sat in her kitchen with Elizabeth Thompson's testimony spread across the table, trying to process the magnitude of what she had learned. The woman whose locket she had found in the cave hadn't been a victim of random violence or even a casualty of frontier conflicts. She had been murdered for trying to prevent a massacre, killed by the very people who should have protected her. And Louise's own family had been at the center of it all, profiting from blood money for more than a century while maintaining the fiction that they were respectable. pioneers who had built their success through honest work. The question now was what Louise was going to do with Elizabeth Thompson's testimony. She could seal it back in the hidden chamber and pretend she had never found it, protecting her family's reputation and her own financial security. Or she could honor Elizabeth's courage by ensuring that her testimony finally received the attention she had hoped it would. Yet when she risked her life to document the truth, as Louise looked out at the eastern ridge where the cave held its secrets, she thought about Elizabeth Thompson hiding in the rocks, watching people she had trusted commit unspeakable acts of violence. Elizabeth had found the strength to bear witness even when it put her own life in danger. The least Louise could do was find the strength to share that witness with the world, even if it destroyed everything she had thought she knew about her place in it. The ceremonial pipe had arrived in Louise's dreams before she ever saw it with waking eyes. 3 nights running, she dreamed of red stone carved with silver patterns, of hands passing the sacred object through generations, of smoke rising toward cave ceilings painted with symbols she was only beginning to understand. When Dr. Torres emerged from the deepest section of the cave that Thursday morning, carrying something wrapped in deteriorated but still recognizable ceremonial cloth, Louise felt the strange sensation of prophecy fulfilled. "Mrs. Hartwell, you need to see this," Dr. Torres had called, her voice carrying a reverence that went beyond professional excitement. "This changes everything we thought we knew about the spiritual significance of this site." The pipe was exquisite beyond anything Louise had imagined. Carved from red stone that seemed to glow in the morning light, it bore silver inlays that formed patterns matching the symbols on the cave walls exactly. The craftsmanship spoke of countless hours of devoted work, of spiritual significance that elevated the object far beyond mere artifact. This wasn't just a tool for ceremony. It was a sacred connection between the physical and spiritual worlds, something that would have been used only in the most important religious observances. The cloth it was wrapped in dates to the 1880s, Dr. Torres had explained, her hands trembling slightly as she held the pipe. But the pipe itself is much older, probably passed down through several generations before it ended up in this cave. Mrs. Hartwell, this tells us that the people who died here weren't just defending property claims. They were protecting something sacred, something that connected them to their ancestors and their spiritual traditions. Louise had reached out to touch the silver inlays, feeling the weight of history in the cool metal. Each pattern told a story, represented a connection to the land that went deeper than legal documents or territorial claims. The Native American families who had died in this cave hadn't just been fighting for the right to live on their ancestral territory. They had been defending their right to maintain spiritual connections that were fundamental to their identity. That afternoon, Louise had called Chairman Clearwater to describe the pipe's discovery. The silence on the other end of the line had stretched so long that she'd begun to worry the connection had been lost. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an emotion she hadn't heard before. Not just sadness, but something approaching awe. "Mrs. Hartwell, based on your description, that sounds like the autumn ceremony pipe that belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Morning Star Woman," he had said. "The family stories say it was lost when the autumn families disappeared in the 1880s. If that's the same pipe, then we know for certain who these people were and why they were at the cave. The autumn families, 7 related families who left the reservation in September 1885 to conduct the traditional autumn ceremonies at sacred sites in their ancestral territory. They had permission from the tribal council and believed they had assurance from territorial authorities that they wouldn't be interfered with. None of them ever returned. Louise had felt pieces of the historical puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. The massacre hadn't been a spontaneous outbreak of frontier violence or even a calculated response to land disputes. It had been the systematic murder of families who were engaged in peaceful religious observance, people who had been following both tribal tradition and territorial law when they were killed. The weight of this revelation had pressed down on Louise, as she'd spent the evening preparing for what she knew would be the most difficult conversation of her life. She had decided to hold a press conference to make Elizabeth Thompson's testimony and all the evidence they'd discovered available to the world. The decision would devastate her family's reputation, probably cost her the ranch, and certainly end her relationship with Michael. But the alternative, allowing the truth to remain buried while the perpetrator's descendants continued to benefit from their ancestors. Grimes had become unthinkable, the planning for the press. Conference had revealed just how many people had stakes in keeping the historical truth buried. Dr. Torres had been contacted by university administrators who expressed concerns about the political implications of her research and suggested that perhaps the evidence was being overinterpreted. The suggestion that she scale back her conclusions or delay publication of her findings had been presented as academic caution. But Dr. Torres recognized it as pressure to participate in the same kind of cover-up that had hidden the truth for more than a century. Mrs. Hartwell, they're trying to do to us what was done to Elizabeth Thompson, Dr. Torres had said during one of their evening planning sessions. They're trying to silence the people who want to tell the truth about what happened. The difference is that this time, we have evidence they can't destroy and allies they can't intimidate. Chairman Clearwater had brought crucial support when he'd arrived with a delegation from the tribal council, their presence lending both dignity and legal weight to Louise's decision to go public. The tribal government had voted unanimously to support the revelation of the evidence, despite warnings from their own lawyers about potential complications if property disputes arose from the historical disclosures. Mrs. Hartwell, our people have been waiting more than a century for the truth about what happened to the Autumn families, Chairman Clearwater had said. We're not going to let concerns about property values or political complications prevent that truth from finally being told. But not everyone was supportive of Louise's plan. Michael had returned from Denver with a team of lawyers, this time including specialists in elder law who were prepared to challenge Louise's mental competency if she refused to abandon what they characterized as a destructive obsession with historical events. The legal papers they'd brought painted Louise as an isolated, elderly woman who had become emotionally unstable following her husband's death and was now being manipulated by outside parties with political agendas. Mom, you're about to destroy everything our family has built over 4 generations, Michael had said during their final confrontation before the press conference. Even if every word of that woman's testimony is true, you don't owe these people anything. You weren't alive when it happened. You didn't participate in any crimes. You don't have to sacrifice your life to atone for something your great-grandfather did. Louise had looked at her son, seeing David's determination in his face, but none of David's commitment to truth over personal comfort. Michael, I've lived on this land my entire life. I've raised cattle in meadows where children were murdered. I've drawn water from streams that ran red with innocent blood. Every day of my life has been built on the foundation of what happened in that cave. How can you say I didn't benefit from those crimes? The threats against Louise had escalated as the press conference approached, moving from anonymous notes to property damage that was clearly intended as intimidation. Her fence lines had been cut, her water supply had been contaminated, and someone had left gutted animals on her front porch with notes warning her that she could suffer the same fate if she continued her interference in family business. Tom Kellerman had stopped by to warn her that some community members were organizing to prevent the press conference from taking place. Mrs. Hartwell, I've heard talk about plans to disrupt your event, he'd said. These folks see what you're doing as an attack on their families and their way of life. I can't provide official protection for a press conference on private property, but I want you to know that some people are taking this very personally. Louise had appreciated Tom's warning, but it had only strengthened her resolve to proceed. The fact that some people were willing to use violence to prevent the truth from being told proved that the truth needed to be told. Fear and intimidation had been used to silence Elizabeth Thompson in 1885, and Louise refused to let the same tactics succeed in silencing her more than a century later. Frank Morrison had made one final attempt to dissuade Louise from going public with the evidence, arriving at her ranch on the evening before the press conference with a bottle of whiskey and a plea that touched on their decades of friendship. "Louise, I've known your family since before you were born," he'd said, his weathered face heavy with concern. "Your father was the best friend I ever had, and I've watched you grow into a woman he would have been proud of. That's why I'm asking you to reconsider this course of action before it destroys everything you care about." "Frank, your grandfather's name is in Elizabeth Thompson's testimony," Louise had replied. "He was part of the conspiracy that planned the massacre. Have you known about this all along?" Frank had been quiet for a long time, staring out toward the eastern ridge where the cave held its secrets. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a burden he'd been carrying for decades. "My grandfather told my father the truth before he died, and my father told me," he'd said. "Not all the details, but enough to know that the official story about how this valley was settled wasn't complete. There were conflicts, people died, and our families built their lives on land that maybe shouldn't have been ours to claim. And you've just lived with that knowledge." "Louise, what choice did we have? The people who died were already dead. The people who killed them were already dead. Exposing what happened wouldn't bring anyone back, but it would destroy the lives of everyone who's built something here since then. Sometimes the cost of truth is higher than the cost of silence." Louise had understood Frank's reasoning, but she couldn't accept it. The cost of silence, she'd realized, was measured in more than just comfort and financial security. It was measured in the spiritual weight of living on land that had been stolen through murder, in the moral corruption of building prosperity on a foundation of lies, in the ongoing injustice to families who had never learned what happened to their missing ancestors. That night, Louise had walked to the cave entrance one final time before the press conference, carrying the ceremonial pipe that would be returned to the tribal community the next day. The moon was full, casting silver light across the ridge and illuminating the symbols carved into the stone by people who had wanted their stories to survive, even when they couldn't. She'd sat in the cave for more than an hour, holding the sacred pipe and thinking about Morning Star Woman and the other members of the Autumn families who had come to this place for spiritual communion with their ancestors. They had followed proper protocols, obtained necessary permissions, and conducted themselves according to both tribal tradition and territorial law. Their reward had been systematic murder by neighbors who saw their spiritual practices as obstacles to land acquisition. Tomorrow, Louise would honor Elizabeth Thompson's courage by sharing her testimony with the world. She would return the sacred pipe to Chairman Clearwater and the tribal community, acknowledging their right to reclaim both their ancestors' remains and the sacred objects that belonged with them. She would demand that the victims of the massacre finally receive the justice they had been denied for more than a century, even if that justice came at the cost of everything she had thought she valued. The decision felt less like a choice than like a recognition of something that had been decided the moment she'd first seen those carved symbols in the cave. Some truths were too important to bury, some silences had lasted too long, and some debts could only be paid with the courage to face uncomfortable realities about the past. The media had arrived before dawn, their satellite trucks and cameras transforming Louise's quiet ranch into something resembling a military encampment. Representatives from 3 television networks, 2 national newspapers, and half a dozen regional outlets had responded to the carefully worded press release that Dr. Torres had distributed. Significant archaeological discovery reveals previously unknown historical events in Colorado Valley. Louise had watched the setup from her kitchen window, drinking coffee and trying to calm the nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. In 3 hours, she would stand before these cameras and destroy everything her family had built over 4 generations. The original treaty documents that Dr. Torres had found in the hidden chamber were spread across her kitchen table legal papers that proved the land claims filed by the murdered families had been legitimate under territorial law. Chairman Clearwater had arrived with a delegation from the tribal council, their presence lending dignity and gravity to what could have been dismissed as an elderly woman's obsession with old bones. The tribal representatives had brought traditional clothing for the ceremony that would accompany the return of the sacred pipe, and Louise could see them preparing near the cave entrance, their movements deliberate and reverent. Dr. Torres had spent the morning coordinating with federal authorities who had finally agreed to attend the press conference, though Louise suspected their presence was more about damage control than genuine interest in justice. Assistant Attorney General Webb had returned with a larger team, their expression suggesting they were prepared for a crisis rather than a historical revelation. But it was the growing crowd of local residents that worried Louise most. By 10 o'clock, more than 100 people had gathered along the ridge, some carrying signs supporting Louise's decision to reveal the truth, others clearly there to express their opposition. She could see Frank Morrison standing with a group of older men whose families had been in the valley since the territorial period, their faces grim with determination. Michael had arrived with his legal team just as the press conference was scheduled to begin, making one final attempt to stop what he saw as his mother's descent into madness. The competency papers were still working their way through the court system, but he'd obtained a temporary restraining order that could potentially halt the proceedings if he could convince a judge that Louise was acting under psychological duress. "Mom, it's not too late to stop this," he'd pleaded as they stood near the cave entrance, reporters and cameras just yards away. "You can say you need more time to verify the evidence, or that you want to work with authorities to handle this properly. You don't have to destroy everything today." Louise had looked at her son, seeing David's determination in his face, but none of David's commitment to truth over comfort. "Michael, I've spent 3 months verifying this evidence." Elizabeth Thompson waited more than a century for someone to share her testimony. "How much more time do you think they need?" Before Michael could respond, Chairman Clearwater had approached with the ceremonial pipe, its red stone surface gleaming in the morning sun. Louise could see the intricate silver inlays that matched the symbols carved into the cave walls, patterns that connected this sacred object to the people who had died protecting it. "Mrs. Hartwell," Chairman Clearwater had said, "my ancestors are watching what happens here today. They've waited long enough for justice." Dr. Torres had called for attention from the assembled crowd, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. What we're about to share with you represents one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Colorado history, with implications that extend far beyond academic interest." Louise had taken her position at a podium that had been set up near the cave entrance, the folders containing Elizabeth Thompson's testimony and the supporting evidence arranged before her. She could see the television cameras focusing on her face, feel the weight of attention from dozens of reporters and hundreds of community members. "My name is Louise Hartwell," she had begun, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. 3 months ago, I discovered a cave on my property that I thought might have historical significance. What I found inside has forced me to confront some difficult truths about my family and my community." A murmur had run through the crowd as Louise began to describe the discovery of the human remains, the pottery, and the symbols that had first drawn her into the cave's depths. She could see Frank Morrison shaking his head sadly, as if watching an old friend make a terrible mistake. But the most significant discovery was made by Dr. Rebecca Torres and her archaeological team. Louise had continued, gesturing toward the archaeologist. "Dr. Torres, would you please explain what we found in the hidden chamber?" Dr. Torres had stepped forward, her professional demeanor commanding attention, even from those who clearly didn't want to hear what she had to say. In a sealed section of the cave, we discovered documents that had been preserved for more than 130 years. These documents include a first-person account of a massacre that took place at this location in September 1885. The reaction from the crowd had been immediate and intense. Supporters had pressed forward to hear better, while opponents had begun shouting questions and challenges. Michael had moved closer to the podium, his face pale, with the realization that there was no stopping what his mother had set in motion. Louise had raised her hand for quiet, knowing that the most difficult part of the revelation was still to come. The witness to this massacre was Elizabeth Thompson, a territorial clerk who was murdered for trying to prevent it, Louise had said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. Her testimony, which I'm going to read to you now, describes how a group of settlers planned and executed the systematic murder of Native American families to steal their land. Louise had opened the folder containing Elizabeth's carefully preserved testimony, the pages still legible after more than a century in the sealed chamber. As she began reading Elizabeth's account of the conspiracy meetings, the planning sessions, and the detailed preparations for mass murder, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on everyone present. The attack took place at dawn on September 15, 1885, Louise had continued, reading directly from Elizabeth's testimony. The victims were families who had come to this sacred cave for an autumn ceremony. They were killed with specially forged weapons, designed to leave no trace of their attacker's identity. A woman in the crowd had gasped audibly when Louise read the list of conspirators' names that Elizabeth had recorded. Frank Morrison's face had gone pale as his grandfather's name was spoken aloud, along with the ancestors of other families who still lived in the valley. The television cameras had captured every reaction, every shocked expression and angry denial, but it was when Louise revealed her own family's role in the massacre that the confrontation reached its peak. "The leader of this conspiracy was my great-grandfather, Thomas Hartwell," she had said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the admission. Elizabeth Thompson's testimony makes it clear that he organized the massacre and personally participated in the killings. Michael had stepped forward then, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Mom, stop this right now. You're destroying our family based on documents that could be forgeries, stories that could be completely fabricated. You have no proof that any of this actually happened." Dr. Torres had responded by presenting the sacred bundle containing personal items that had been found with the remains, jewelry, clothing fragments, and tools that had belonged to the massacre victims. "Mr. Hartwell, we have physical evidence that corroborates Ms. Thompson's testimony. These items were found arranged with the bodies in a manner consistent with traditional burial practices, suggesting that someone survived the massacre long enough to honor the dead." Chairman Clearwater had stepped forward to receive the sacred bundle from Dr. Torres, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he accepted the artifacts that had belonged to his ancestors. The ceremony was simple but profound, conducted in both English and the tribal language, acknowledging the return of sacred objects to their proper caretakers. "These items belong to our people," Chairman Clearwater had said, addressing the cameras and the crowd. "They were taken from us through violence and deception, and they've been hidden in the earth for more than a century. Today they come home." The tribal ceremony had been interrupted by shouting from the crowd as some of the valley's long-time residents began demanding that Louise stop what they saw as an attack on their community's reputation. Frank Morrison had pushed forward, his voice rising above the chaos. "Louise, this is enough," he had called out. "Even if everything you're saying is true, what's the point of dragging it all up now? The people responsible are dead. The victims are dead. All you're doing is hurting people who had nothing to do with what happened." But Louise had been prepared for this argument. She'd pulled out copies of the fraudulent land claims and territorial documents that Dr. Torres had found in the hidden chamber, evidence that the conspiracy had involved not just murder, but systematic theft of Native American property. "Frank, this isn't just about what happened in 1885, she had said. This is about the fact that nearly every piece of property in this valley was claimed through fraud and violence. The families who were murdered had filed legitimate claims for this land under territorial law. When they were killed, those claims were simply ignored, and the land was taken by their murderers. The legal implications of this revelation had sent a visible shock through the crowd. Property rights that had seemed secure for more than a century were suddenly questionable. Families who had built their wealth on land their ancestors had claimed were facing the possibility that those claims had no legal foundation. Assistant Attorney General Webb had finally stepped forward, his expression grim as he addressed the assembled media. The federal government will be conducting a full investigation into these allegations. If the evidence supports the claims being made here today, there will be significant legal consequences for all parties involved. What kind of legal consequences? A reporter had called out. Property disputes, reparations claims, possible federal charges related to civil rights violations, Webb had replied. This case potentially involves violations of federal law that have no statute of limitations. Louise had watched the faces in the crowd as the full scope of the revelation became clear. Some people were clearly devastated by the implications for their families and their financial security. Others seemed relieved that a long-held secret was finally being brought into the light. But everyone understood that nothing would ever be the same in their small mountain valley. As the press conference had concluded and the media began filing their stories, Louise had stood at the cave entrance with Chairman Clearwater and Dr. Torres, looking out over the land that had been shaped by violence and lies for more than a century. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, the legal battles, the investigations, the difficult process of trying to make amends for historical crimes. But today, Elizabeth Thompson's courage had finally been honored, and the truth she had died protecting was no longer buried in the darkness of the cave. 3 months after the press conference, Louise stood beside the new memorial stone that marked the entrance to what was now officially designated as the Blackbird Creek Sacred Site. The granite monument bore inscriptions in both English and the tribal language, honoring the victims of the 1885 massacre and acknowledging the truth that had been hidden for so long. The stone had been carved by a tribal artist working in collaboration with Louise and the archaeological team, its surface decorated with symbols that matched those found on the cave walls. At the base of the monument, visitors had left offerings, flowers, small stones, photographs, and personal items that spoke to the continuing power of the site to touch people's hearts. Dr. Torres had been hired by the Tribal Council to establish a cultural center on the site, her firing from the university having been quickly followed by a position that allowed her to continue her work without institutional pressure to minimize inconvenient discoveries. The center would preserve Elizabeth Thompson's testimony and the other artifacts found in the cave, ensuring that future generations would have access to the complete story of what had happened in Blackbird Valley. Mrs. Hartwell, Dr. Torres had said that morning, I wanted you to know that the federal investigation has confirmed everything Elizabeth documented in her testimony. The FBI has officially classified the 1885 killings as a hate crime and a violation of territorial law, even though the perpetrators are beyond legal prosecution. Louise had nodded, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. The truth had been established beyond any reasonable doubt, but justice in any meaningful sense remained elusive. The dead couldn't be brought back to life, and the living descendants of both victims and perpetrators had to find ways to move forward with the knowledge of what their ancestors had done and suffered. The legal ramifications were still unfolding, but the initial settlements had been more generous than anyone had expected. The federal government had agreed to purchase the sacred site and surrounding lands at above-market prices, with the proceeds going to both Louise and the tribal community. Several other property owners in the valley had negotiated similar agreements. preferring to sell rather than face protracted legal battles over the validity of their claims. Michael had not spoken to Louise since the day of the press conference, but his legal challenge to her competency had been quietly withdrawn after the federal investigation confirmed the accuracy of her claims. Through their mutual lawyer, he had indicated that he was re-evaluating his position on the situation, which Louise interpreted as his way of acknowledging that she had been right, without actually admitting he had been wrong. More encouraging was the response from her daughter Sarah, who had flown out from Seattle with the grandchildren to attend the memorial service that had been held for the massacre victims. Sarah had been initially skeptical of her mother's decision to go public with the discovery, but seeing the sacred site and meeting with tribal representatives had changed her perspective. "Mom, I'm proud of what you did," Sarah had said as they stood together beside the memorial stone. "It took courage to give up everything you'd built to honor people you'd never met. I hope I would have that kind of integrity if I were faced with the same choice." The memorial service itself had been a profound experience, conducted according to traditional tribal protocols, with participation from family members who had driven from across the region to honor their ancestors. Chairman Clearwater had led the ceremony, but Louise had been invited to speak about Elizabeth Thompson and the courage it had taken for her to document the truth despite the personal danger. Elizabeth Thompson knew that bearing witness to evil was more important than protecting herself. Louise had said to the assembled crowd, she understood that some truths are too important to bury, even when telling them costs everything. We honor her memory by promising that the people who died in this place will never be forgotten again. Frank Morrison had attended the memorial service, one of several Valley residents who had publicly acknowledged their families' roles in the historical crimes. His decision to speak openly about his grandfather's participation in the massacre had encouraged others to come forward with family stories and documents that had been hidden for generations. Louise was right. Frank had told a reporter after the service, "Some of us have been carrying these secrets for too long. It's better to face the truth than to keep living with lies, even when the truth is ugly." Not everyone in the community had been as willing to accept the new reality. Several families had left the valley rather than deal with the ongoing investigations and media attention. Property values had indeed declined, as Brad Coleman had predicted, but the area was slowly attracting a different kind of resident, people drawn by the historical significance of the site and the community's commitment to confronting its difficult past rather than hiding from it. Louise had used her proceeds from the land sale to establish a scholarship fund for Native American students pursuing archaeology and historical research. She'd kept enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life, but the bulk of her wealth had gone to support the kind of work that Dr. Torres and Chairman Clearwater were doing, work that honored the past by ensuring it was fully understood. As the sun set behind the western peaks on this quiet December evening, Louise walked slowly around the memorial site, reading the names that had been carved into the stone. Elizabeth Thompson's name was there alongside the Native American victims, honoring her as someone who had died trying to prevent the massacre rather than as a casualty of random violence. The sacred cave had been sealed to protect it from vandalism and unauthorized visitors, but Louise still felt the presence of the people who had been buried there. Their stories had finally been told, their deaths acknowledged, their sacred objects returned to their proper caretakers. Elizabeth Thompson's century-long vigil was over, and the truth she had died protecting was no longer hidden in the darkness. Louise had lost her family's ranch, her relationship with her son, and the comfortable certainties that had shaped her understanding of her place in the world. But she had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that she had chosen truth over comfort, justice over security, and the welfare of people she had never met over the protection of lies that had benefited her family for generations. Some prices were worth paying, and some debts could only be settled with courage.